Have you ever done something in haste and could really use a do-over?
Right? I mean, who couldn't?
Last year, my amazing wife got a new job working from home, but it happened so fast we had to shoehorn a makeshift office into this small storage room, and the transition, it wasn't very clean. Ooh, is that my final episode of Seinfeld? Well, that's definitely not my proudest moment, but I'm going to take that situation and make it right and turn that space into her ultimate dream office. I'm going to start by making some clean modern cabinets to add work surface and storage. Then some matching floating shelves using my favorite method, a tricked out sit-stand workstation, and what I think will put this over the top, an accent plant wall that became one of my most challenging builds to date. Well, it's not going to build itself. Let's get into it. First up, cabinets. So as you can see, my workflow for breaking down plywood begins by setting each sheet on my assembly table on top of a piece of pink foam insulation. If you don't have an assembly table, that's fine. Just look into getting something like a centipede or even some sawhorses, because this is just so much easier than scooting around on the floor. And it's just too cumbersome and dangerous to run full sheets of plywood across the table saw, so I like to use my track saw to break all this down into manageable chunks first. And if you don't have a track saw, that's not a problem. You can use a regular circular saw. Just make sure you have some type of jig like this or a straight edge you can reference to make nice straight cuts. I will say though that graduating to a track saw is so much more useful because you can utilize things like rail squares on the guide rail. Because if you're off square from the beginning, it's just going to be more work to get everything corrected later. And because this panel was too wide for my table saw, the parallel guide was clutch in making sure that all the parts that I cut from this are going to be the exact same length. Now I can begin cutting all my parts to final dimensions. Now that I have all my cabinet parts, I need to cut a notch out of the corner of each of the side pieces to make a toe kick. And to do that, it's going to be pretty simple. I've just got a square and a pencil to mark my layout lines. And then to cut it out, you have a few options. My go-to is to use a bandsaw. And one reason I love this method so much is because I get to use these mag switches. You just place the mag switch anywhere on a cast iron surface and turn the little handle, and now you have a perfect positive stop to make fast, repeatable cuts accurately. But if you don't have a bandsaw, no worries, you can easily cut out these notches with a jigsaw and a square like this. You have to go slow and cut carefully, but it's pretty easy to get clean, straight cuts using this method. And if you're bereft of jigsaw, you can always give it a go with a handsaw. I don't really recommend cutting plywood with a handsaw, but if that's all you got, give it a try. I mean, it's toe kicks. Nobody's looking at your toe kicks. All right, now that I have those notches cut out, it's time to focus on assembly. I'm going to keep construction nice and simple and use pocket holes for everything. So I'm going to go cut those holes, and then we'll get started putting this thing together. I'm going to start by assembling the base first, and it's going to be made up of a toe kick, a nailer, and 2 center supports. Once I fasten the nailer, I can use the center support as a spacer to get perfect placement on the toe kick without fussing with a tape measure. Another good reason to use a spacer is that it gives me some place to press against when I'm inserting and driving in these pocket screws. Then I just repeat that process with the other side and then go back and add the center supports in the middle using another spacer. Spacers make this easy. Now I can slide the bottom of the cabinet onto this base, and you can see how the bottom actually creates the top of the toe kick. Pretty cool. I'm going to fasten this to the base by screwing it in from the top. This is just a much faster option, and because I'm putting drawers and sliding trays into this cabinet, these screw holes are not going to be seen. And to do this, I'm using my favorite countersink drill bit to drill the pilot holes and cut a countersink at the same time so that the heads of the screws sit below the surface nice and tidy. So you may have noticed these exposed pocket holes, and that's okay. That's the way they're supposed to be installed. This front is going to be covered by a piece of painted trim when the cabinets get installed, and these won't be seen. Then I can flip this over and secure the bottom to the sides with pocket screws. You can also use pocket screws to fasten the bottom to the base if you don't want to add drawers and don't want those screws to be visible from the inside. Okay, now I need to flip this back over and add the rest of the stretchers and nailers. So what's the deal with these names, stretchers and nailers? Kind of sounds confusing because they look like the same part, but here's the difference. Stretchers are the horizontal pieces that run along the top of the cabinet, and their main job is to keep the sides of the cabinet nice and parallel, which also helps keep the cabinet square. These are not load-bearing. If you look here, there's quite a bit of flex in this, and all of the weight of the countertop and anything you put on the countertop, that load gets transferred down through the sides of the cabinet. One other job that you can use the stretchers for is attaching the countertop to the cabinet when you're installing it. And nailers are the vertical pieces that go on the back of the cabinet, and they have two jobs. The first is keeping the cabinet from racking from side to side, and the other one, as the name suggests, is to serve as an anchor point for attaching the cabinet to the wall. And now, you know.
And knowing is half the battle.
Okay, back to the assembly. Next, I need to add the center dividers. And these dividers get a small notch cut in the top to account for the top nailer, and I made these the same way that I made the toe kick notches. I like doing it this way so I keep those back nailers as one continuous piece rather than having to cut them into 3 pieces and fasten them to the center dividers. I just think it's faster and makes the cabinets more structurally strong. And by the way, I'm using the same spacers that I used to add the center supports to the base. This way I know that those center dividers sit right on top of where those center supports are, so any weight put on the cabinet is transferred straight to the ground and I won't get any sagging on such a long cabinet. And with the back of this cabinet still open, now would be a perfect time to add shelf pin holes, which I did just using a jig that I made from scrap wood. And to finish off the carcass, I'm going to add a back panel out of 1/4-inch ply. This is really just to prevent seeing the wall behind the cabinet. Some people think that adding a back panel is meant to keep the cabinet square and prevent racking, but a properly built cabinet will not rack regardless of having a back panel or not. It's purely a cosmetic addition and can be discarded if you don't want it. I've got this carcass nearly complete except for one final detail. And because I want this cabinet to have a clean modern look, I'm not going to be adding a face frame to it, but I do still need to cover up these plywood edges. And because I'm going to be painting the fronts of this cabinet, that means I can use strips of hardwood to make that edge banding. And I've just got some 1/4-inch thick hard maple that I'm going to be using. I like hard maple here because it's very durable. And I'm going to add them using some quick setting glue. This is Tight Bond Quick and Thick. It's also sold in bigger bottles as trim glue, but it's the exact same glue in the bottle. To hold the pieces in place, you can simply use tape like this and it works really well, but a pin nailer works well too. You just have to fill in some small holes when you're done. One detail you shouldn't overlook is to add the vertical pieces first and then cut the horizontal pieces to fit between. This way you're not going to see any end grain on the finished piece because it'll be hidden at the top and bottom of the cabinet. Okay, this cabinet is ready for paint. Well, almost. The only parts that need paint on these cabinets are the fronts as well as the face frame and the sides of the cabinet. The insides are going to remain natural, so all I need to do is fill any pinholes or defects that I find on the face frame or the sides. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. Painting is a tomorrow me problem. All right, so it's actually a couple days later because the weather here in good old Tennessee has just been, well, not very cooperative. But I wanted to spray outside because I wanted to try my new spray tent as well as a new spray system, and we've got a beautiful sunny day to do it here. It's not too hot, so let's get going. To start, I'm spraying on a primer coat, which is a white pigmented shellac, and I'm going to spray using my older HVLP turbine system. It's an amazing spray system, and I've loved it for years, but it does have 2 big downsides. To use it, you have to be plugged into a power source to run the turbine, and you're also tethered to this long, ungainly hose that needs to deliver the air volume for the sprayer to work. Now, if you have a professional spray booth in your shop, then this is an amazing system to use, but not so much if you spray outdoors. So to do the finish coat, I'm actually going to try out my new Ultimate Quick Shot airless sprayer from Graco. It holds a similar amount of paint, but it's in a much lighter portable system, and the best part is it runs off a DeWalt 20-volt battery. If you're wondering, the battery comes with the system, so you don't have to be a DeWalt tool user to use this sprayer. I think the finish on this thing lays down very nice, and it's a very quick experience. By the way, I'm not sponsored by Graco. I just really like their sprayers, like this new airless system, as well as my older HVLP system. As far as the edge banding goes on the face of the cabinet, I painted that by hand and just masked off the area with some frog tape. So while that finish cures over the next 24 hours, I'm going to head back to the shop and start on that countertop. I decided on white oak for the top, which is going to be the featured wood in all the pieces that I'm making for this office. And I'm using beautiful 8/4 boards that I milled up by chopping to rough length and then cleaning up the rough edges at the table saw. Then I planed all the boards to the exact same thickness and jointed the edges perfectly straight to make seamless joints. These are just going to get glued up. I'm not using any biscuits or dominoes for alignment. I'm just very careful to line everything up nicely because I can't run this back through the planer. It's going to be too wide. Once the glue cures, I can trim the sides up using my track saw and give the edges a slight chamfer and sand everything up nice and smooth to 180 grit. To finish the top, I'm using a Rubio Monocoat 5% Smoke, which I think is a really nice look on white oak. Not only is this super easy to apply, but it smells amazing. After a good smearing on with a spreader to get the pigment into the grain lines, I let it sit for about 10 minutes or so, wipe off the excess, and then let it finish curing overnight. And now it's time to fill this cabinet. And the nice thing about this design is each one of these compartments is spaced exactly the same. So that gives you the flexibility to add the doors or the drawers in whatever configuration works best for your situation. For me, I'm going to add 3 drawers into the middle section and put a door with a pull-out tray on either side. But if you want to put the drawers on one side or the other, that's completely up to you. All the parts are going to be the same size. To make the drawers and trays, I'm using 5/8" Baltic birch. If these were kitchen cabinets, I'd like to use solid wood, but for office cabinets or built-ins, I think using plywood is just fine. Now, I know it can be a real pain for some people to find 5/8" plywood, but it really is the ideal thickness for drawers. So if you have to use something more easy to find, then I'd recommend going down to 1/2 inch because 3/4 inch is just going to be way too chunky for these size drawers. I'm also upping the functionality of this cabinet by adding some slide-out trays behind the doors. These are meant to hold larger, heavier items, so I'm going to go ahead and make the bottoms out of more of that 5/8" plywood, and this is going to sit inside grooves in the side held together with glue. These can hold something like a trash can. My wife also has a couple of sewing machines stored in that room that she can now tuck away neatly behind a door and keep it out of sight. My drawer box assembly method is pretty simple. First, I need to add a 1/4 inch groove down the side of 3 of the drawer sides. The back doesn't get a groove, and I'll explain why later. A table saw or a router is good for getting these grooves cut. Now to assemble, I'm just using pocket screws. You can add glue if you want, but I've never really found that necessary, and getting glue squeezed out in the corners is a hassle I don't want to take on, having to tape off all my corners. And notice that I'm assembling this upside down so that the drawer back aligns with the top side of the drawer, which creates a gap at the bottom, and that's key. After checking to make sure everything is square as a bear, I can just slide in the bottom panel right in place from the back and pre-drill and countersink some holes and then secure it with screws. In my opinion, this method of construction is way easier than trying to capture the bottom panel in place while you assemble the 4 sides. And again, leaving that gap in the bottom on the back is going to play a part when it comes time to install these drawers. All right, 1 down, 2 to go. And now it's time for everybody's favorite part of making cabinets, and that's installing drawers.
What?
I know, this is really a confusing process, but let me show you my favorite trick for making this really easy. My favorite tip to install slides is to use a scrap of ply as a spacer. This is the quickest and easiest way to ensure that both slides are exactly in line with one another. I'm going to start with the top set of slides and get those in place first. Then I can head to the table saw and cut that scrap of plywood down to match the height of the next set of slides. This process works for each successive set of slides until you reach the bottom. By the way, I'm installing undermount slides here because I don't want the slides visible on the side of the drawers, but this installation method works exactly the same way with side mount slides. If you choose to use side mount slides, the only thing you need to do is adjust the width of the drawer boxes to account for the thickness of side mount slides, which is different than undermount slides. So to use undermount slides, you've got to install these little latches to the underside of your drawers, and these go up here on the front side of the drawer. These lock the drawer in place, and it also gives you all of your adjustability from side to side and up and down using these dials and levers. And these are just fastened into place with a couple of small screws. And because of how I build my drawer boxes, I don't have to cut the little notches here on the backside to accept the drawer slides because this whole thing is open. And the last thing you have to do is drill a couple of small holes on the backside of the drawer, and that's going to be where this little tab fits into that locks the drawer to the slide. You can, of course, buy a little universal jig like this one that's going to locate that hole exactly where it needs to go. But this is expensive and plastic and stupid, and we don't need it. Let me show you a much easier way. So just take your drawer, set it on its end, and grab your drawer slide and place it on the back of the drawer where it would be inside the cabinet. And now that little pin is going to be right above where it needs to slide into that hole. And just use the pin like this, bam, bam, bam. And now you located exactly where that needs to go, and you didn't need a jig. Okay, here's how crazy easy it is to install undermount slides. Just take your drawer box and sit the sides of the drawer over these bars, and then push straight back until you hear the latches click into place. In a matter of a minute or two, I have all the drawers and trays installed in my cabinet. That's it. That's all there is to it. And now I have a nice clean look on the side of my drawer boxes. By the way, I do have a video that goes into more detail about how to properly space drawers inside a cabinet. If you'd like to learn more about that, I'll leave a link to that at the end of this one. But for now, I've got more work to do. Now for the doors and drawer fronts, I wanted a clean, modern look. No frame and panels, just simple panels made out of MDF. I went with MDF because it's a lot more stable than hardwood or plywood. These doors are pretty wide and there's a definite risk of those warping over time, and I did not want that to happen. I have all of this cut to size and painted already, but what I wanted to show you is how I install all this to get the perfect spacing around the edge of each one. I like to start at the bottom with a scrap of plywood that I fasten under the toe kick using two-sided tape. This will be a little shelf that acts like a helping hand and also a reference to the bottom edge of the cabinet. And because I want a 1/8 inch reveal, I'm adding a 1/8 inch spacer that I cut out of maple, and I'm just going to set that right on my little ledge. Then I can set my first drawer on top of that and clamp it to the drawer. Then I can countersink some pilot holes and secure the drawer front with screws from the inside of the drawer. Yeah, that's the ticket. And now I can just work my way up, repeating that same process of using the spacers to align everything perfectly. To install the doors, I'm using Blum Inserta hinges, which don't require any screws to fasten them to the door. For the cabinet side, I need to mark a line at 37 millimeters, which is the setback distance that I need to place the hinge plates. And with the hinge plates installed on the hinges, I set the door on top of my spacer, and then I line up those hinge plates with the lines that I drew on the inside of the cabinet. That's going to tell me where my holes need to go. Admittedly, this is kind of a janky method, but I get perfectly placed hinges every time I do it, so I just keep doing it this way. And with the door installed, I can check the operation of the tray, and so all that planning, and it comes down to buying the wrong hinges. Right now, the hinges I've bought make it so that the door protrudes inside the cabinet a little bit, and now this slide-out tray is not going to work the way I intended. Totally fixable. I just have to buy the right hinge called a zero protrusion hinge, which will set the door slightly outside of the edge of the cabinet, and the tray will come out as I designed it to. So just got to wait for those new hinges. And after looking up the install requirements for the right hinges, they are in fact the same, so I just went ahead and installed the other door, knowing that I can swap out the hinges when they arrive and not skip a beat. The door does need some slight micro adjustments just to get that reveal perfect, and bam, done. Well, in spite of the snafu with the hinges, I think this turned out amazing. I've got the perfect 1/8 inch reveal around each one of my panels, exactly like I designed, and it was super easy to do. Now for the drawer pulls, I'm going with a simple design that's just going to mount on top like this. I'm going to go ahead and get those installed now, and then assembly on this cabinet is done. These pulls could not be easier to install. I just made a mark where the edge of the hinge needs to go and then drill a couple pilot holes and screw them into place. The pulls on the door are the same, and what I like about these pulls is that they're thin enough that even with a 1/8 inch reveal, they don't interfere with the operation of the drawers, and I didn't have to recess them. There is one final detail. I did want to add some shelves, and that's why I added those shelf pin holes earlier, and I just edge banded the front side of the shelf so that it looked clean from the front edge, and I'm just using iron-on edge banding. Super easy to use and really fast as well. So this installation is going to be a little different than normal because we have carpet in this room currently that we eventually plan to pull out and put hardwoods down, but since that's not happening right now, I'm going to do a partial installation of these cabinets. What that means is I'm not going to cut out any of the carpet, and I'm not going to remove the baseboards behind the cabinet. I'm just going to set it against the wall, and I've got a couple of 1/2 inch spacers on the back side of the cabinet that are making up the difference between the wall and the baseboards. That way I can safely secure the cabinets to the studs using cabinet screws. The other thing is the toe kicks. Right now they're exposed. Normally I'd put a piece of white trim over that to make it look nice and tidy, but you can't really see them when you're walking around in the room, and I'll wait to install that once the floors are in and I do a proper install of the cabinets. And the countertop is easy to install. I'm just going to screw it in from underneath into elongated holes that I made in the stretchers. I made those just using my domino because it was so easy, but you can accomplish the same thing just using a drill and a drill bit by wiggling it back and forth like this. I pre-drilled the holes first and then added 3 screws along the front and back sides. All that's left to do now is reinstall the insides, and this cabinet's in its new home and ready to organize. This cabinet looks so clean and simple. It's got a lot of storage options, and I even got the new hinges just in time so that my trays actually slide out. And while you weren't looking, I made a second cabinet. This one's only 4 feet long instead of 6 feet, and it has 2 deep drawers, but the construction was exactly the same. Man, I'm super excited I got to add these cabinets to my wife's office. Not gonna lie, a little jealous they're not in my office, but they're gonna give her a ton of new horizontal workspace and a load of new storage options. And now that these cabinets are done down here, we're gonna focus upwards and get some shelves put in. To make the shelves, I'm going with more of that 8/4 wide oak to match the countertops. And the first thing to do is to scribe a center line on the back side of the shelf, and that's gonna let me know where to locate the shelf support bracket. The shelf brackets I'm using are welded steel and made by Shepherd Bracket. I like them because they have these little notches all the way around to accept screws, so that you can place your bracket pretty much anywhere on a wall and still guarantee that you can hit a couple of studs. But to use these brackets, I've got to bore a couple large and deep holes to accept these steel tubes, and so getting the locations of those holes marked accurately is super important. Shepherd Bracket knows this, and they give you this little drill guide that you can center over your marks, and that's going to get your drill bit started straight so that you bore a nice 90-degree hole. Which reminds me, where did I leave that? Oh yeah.
Come to me.
Trigger, don't hit the trigger. Well, that was disappointing in more than one way, but what isn't disappointing is this auger bit. The lead screw on the tip pulls the bit through the workpiece, so drilling these deep holes was nearly effortless. And because it's so effortless, I made sure to use some tape as a tape flag on the bit so that I didn't accidentally blow through the other side. Where does he get those wonderful toys? I've cut enough material here to make one 3-foot shelf and a pair of 2-foot shelves. The auger bit does a pretty good job of evacuating chips, but I do find that there's still a good deal left inside the holes, and I need to get all of that out, otherwise the bracket's not going to see properly. A little tappy tap tap and those chips fall right out and I can check the fit. You do have to tap these in pretty much evenly on both sides because that fit is pretty snug, but it seats perfectly. Well, almost. If I left it like this, the bracket's going to create a gap between the shelf and the wall. No bueno. Let's fix that. So there's 2 ways I've made a recess on the back of a shelf. One is with a table saw, which is effective, but it's more time consuming and also kind of gnarly looking, but you don't end up seeing that anyways once the shelf's installed. The other way is with a router. It's faster and easier and looks a lot cleaner. Handheld router is fine here, but a router table is even better. It's much easier to control the cut on a router table, but it is a blind cut, so I need to add some start and stop marks to my fence with some tape. I can then come back with a chisel and knock off that little sharp point pretty easily. And now when the bracket is seated, it sits flush or just a little below the surface, so the shelf is going to sit flush to the wall, nice and clean. Before I sanded everything, I did add a small chamfer around all the edges except for the back edge that'll face the wall. That way there's just no sharp edges and it gives a nice finished look. These shelves are going to get a smearing of that Rubio Smoke 5% just like the countertops did. I love how easy this stuff is to apply.
Wax on, wax off.
Okay, to install, use your favorite stud finding method to locate the studs behind the wall. Anchor the brackets to the wall using at least 2-inch screws and level it to make sure everything is well level. Then just slide your shelf onto the brackets. And check it one more time. Yep, level as a devil. And for a little extra safety, it can be a good idea to add some screws that lock the shelf to the brackets and keep it from sliding off. One key tip for installing shelves like this is considering which side of the shelf is going to be visible most often. If it's high like this one, put the best face of the shelf on the bottom. And if it's a lower shelf, put the best face on the top. And the same thing goes with the placement of the security screws. Now I can rinse and repeat with these other two shelves. Just in case a little persuasion may be needed, make sure to have a little scrap of plywood and a mallet handy, that way you can tap these shelves home. And 3 shelves installed. That was easy. A little too easy. Let's up the difficulty. I wanted to create an accent wall piece for the office that was also functional. My wife loves tending to plants and it brings her a lot of peace, so hopefully this will go a long way to helping de-stress a busy workday. I have to confess that I love building things and I have a lot of tools at my disposal to do that, but I'm not a great designer. So to help me create this piece, I partner with a Turkish artist who specializes in parametric wooden accent art. I told him I wanted an organic, flowing design, but with the ability to hold plants to bring in some bright colors to all this oaky goodness. With a really rough sketch and a couple of iterations, this is the model of the design we came up with, which is a combination of a standard slat wall but with an integrated parametric curved shelf to serve as a plant stand. And not only did I receive this 3D model, but also the vector files to be able to cut these pieces out on my CNC. This type of project is perfect for a CNC because the accuracy of each of these parts is absolutely critical to the overall look of the final piece. But as easy as it may seem to have a robot cut all these pieces out for me, there was a ridiculous amount of planning that went into this before I could ever turn on the CNC and make my first cut. There were 2 main issues that I had to work around to make the best use of this not cheap white oak. The first is that hardwood lumber is not cut to consistent width. So when you go to buy your material, some boards may be 6 inches wide, some may be 8 or 11 or 14. And so I needed to know ahead of time how wide each of my pieces that I had to cut was going to be to make sure that I could match them up with the closest size board that I could find. And when you have 42 separate slats to cut out, this can get complicated really fast. Secondly was the issue that most of these slats had a rather large profile on them, but also lots of narrow empty space. But I came up with what I think is the best solution to address this. So the way I designed each one of these slats was to create the slat part separate from the contour part. That way I could group these together and cut them out of a single board and do the same thing with all the contour pieces. And that just saves the material, because if this was all one solid piece cut out of one board, there would be an absolute ton of wasted material and it would just drive up the cost of this project significantly. So doing it separate is a smart move, and now I could just fit those back together and glue that, and that's what these little tabs are for, to give me a place for clamps. And that's what I'm going to do for all 42 pieces. Separating the contour pieces from the flat slats definitely saves me on cost of materials, but I also have to carefully manage the process of recombining everything at the end. The first thing I did was just to number all the pieces so that I could match them back up to their corresponding slats. That way I know contour number 5 goes with slat number 5 and so on. This process also made it easier to cut all these parts free of the waste material using rough cuts at my miter saw and then later in the process with my bandsaw. I just had to be double careful not to accidentally chop off one of those tabs and then have to recut that part at the CNC. You can already see what a mess of parts this is going to be, but having them numbered was a huge help to my sanity throughout this process. So I am not normally a person that likes highly repetitive processes, and you'll see throughout this build that there's a ton of repetitive actions, but somehow I made it through this without too much mental turmoil. I think it was the combination of constantly knowing this needed my full attention, because if I screwed up a part, I'd have to recut it and go through this whole set of steps again. So that was definitely a deterrent. But I think the largest driving factor was my desire to see this whole thing come together at the end as one final piece. This project is the textbook definition of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Now with all the parts cut out and trimmed, I can join all the contours to their corresponding slats. A little glue inside the notch is going to be plenty enough to hold this together. I did orient the cuts on all the contours in such a way that ensured that this was going to be a long grain to long grain joint, and I didn't need to use something like dominoes or dowels to reinforce it. The tabs actually worked exactly as I intended them to. I didn't break any of them off when clamping, and even before I added a center clamp, I was getting a good seam of squeeze out all the way across the joint. But I did go ahead and add a center clamp for insurance just to make sure there was no hairline gaps there. So fast forward a bit, after all 42 slats were glued up and out of the clamps, I needed to sand each and every one. Once this is fully installed, you're not going to be able to really see or feel these flat faces on the slats because there's only going to be 3/4 inch of space between each one. So I did a pass with 80 grit and then 120 grit, and only along the front edge did I take it to 180 grit. And then I settled in for a long afternoon of sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding. Okay, the next morning, after I realized the tingling in my arm was from all the sanding and not, in fact, a heart attack,
That's the wrong arm for a heart attack, doofus.
I was excited to try out my brand new tool. For 2 years, I've been eyeing the Lamello Zeta P2, but the hefty price tag meant I needed the right project to justify purchasing one. I saw this slat wall as the perfect use case, which I think you'll see when you see how I'm going to install it. So I pulled the trigger and purchased one from my buddy Keith Johnson, along with a bunch of these Tenso connectors. So what makes the Lamello different from, say, a Festool domino or a biscuit joiner is that it can cut a very specific kind of slot, almost like a T-slot but in an arc. And those slots can accommodate these Tenso connectors. One half of the connector has these little finger-like mini clamps, and the other half, which is going to fit inside a panel board, receives these finger clamps and the whole connector snaps together. I decided each slat was going to get 3 Tensos, which means I need to make a total of 126 slots. So I figured I'm going to be pretty good at this Lamello thing after all that. And the thing that's going to hold all of these slats together in one final piece will be this large back panel, and I'm using 3/4 inch plywood to make it. The entire slat wall measures just under 5 feet square, which means I need to scab on an extra foot of plywood to get it to the width that I need. I'm using a domino to do this, but I'm realizing as I'm editing this video that using the Tenso connectors and some glue would have been the more logical choice since I was already using it. I made sure that seam was, well, seamless as possible, and then set it aside to dry and then paint it. The slats, well, they're not going to be painted. They're going to get a generous and attentive rub down with, you guessed it, Rubio Smoke 5%. This was another day-long process to get all the slats done. Nonetheless, I powered through all these slats and waited another 48 hours for all that to cure enough to handle. And while that was happening, I painted the back panel to match the white of the cabinets and figured out a way to accurately cut the matching Tenso slots. So I'm not going to lie, this is a bit of a daunting task in my mind. I've got 126 of these slots to cut in a grid across this panel, and if any one of those slots is off, it could throw the whole thing off, and I might have to start all over again and cut a whole new panel, which at this point I definitely don't want to do, but I think I have a plan, and I think it's going to go like this. I'm going to start by cutting 3 slots along the edge of the panel using that edge as the reference for where the slots go. That's the way that I drew this up in my Fusion model, so I think we're good to go there. Once those slots are cut, I'm then going to use these Biscos, which are like biscuit joiner biscuits, but they're a little bit fatter and they're made out of plastic, but these are used for dry fit. I'm going to use them in this case as a positive stop. I'm going to stick it in the tenso slots, and then off of that, I'm going to use that as a reference for this tenso spacer stick that I made. And this is going to give me the exact distance that I need to cut my next row of slots. And on this stick, I've got my 3 marks that I transferred from one of my workpieces, one of the slats. When I cut the tenso slots into the slats, that ought to theoretically tell me exactly where each one of the slats needs to go on this panel. And so with this story stick, I ought to be able to get my vertical direction spaced correctly and my horizontal spaced correctly. And then I just need to slog all the way across this panel until I get all of those slots cut. And in theory, it should all just snap together. So if all the planning, cutting, gluing, sanding, and finishing weren't enough, I've now reached the final boss level of tedium. And after installing so many of these tensos, I think I may need a thumb transplant. Constantly pressing those sharp corners into place, oof, I had to pull out the old power glove. But I finally made it all the way across and got all 126 slots cut and tensos installed, and now we reach the moment of truth. Will it all actually work? First though, I need to figure out how I'm going to install this thing by myself, and I think I may have just the thing to help me. This is pretty much my favorite use for Festool sustainers, and with a couple of scraps of ply, I was able to position this at the desired height on the wall. Then I can hoist this thing up and set it right in place while I get it perfectly centered on the wall. I did some careful mathing to figure out where the studs in the wall were located relative to the panel, with the goal in mind of making sure that I could sink these screws in line with the tenso connectors. That way these screws would be completely hidden behind these slats. Oh boy, now the most puckering moment of this entire build. Those clicks are the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. I can't believe that was so easy. Wait, let's do one more just to make sure it's not a fluke. There are no words right now. So instead, I'm just going to shut up and let you watch it unfold. Shoe is right. I am so happy right now. It worked. This whole thing went together perfectly. I can't wait to see this thing loaded up. This thing turned out so well, and I think this is going to be a focal point of the new office. I was even able to get a plant up here to properly test it out, but I am not done with the office yet. I have one more project, which is to build a proper sit-stand workstation. So, let's go. A standing desk can make a world of difference, but being able to make one custom and add some sweet extra features can make it that much better. And that leads me into tip number 1, which is to save yourself some money by buying the base of the desk by itself and building your own custom top. After researching standing desks across multiple brands, I noticed 2 things. There is a wide range in cost on these mechanical bases, anywhere from $150 to $550, depending on how stout and powerful the frame and motors are. I look at this like you kind of get what you pay for and you have some options to fit your budget. The other thing that I noticed is that these companies make a lot of their money off selling you the rest of the desk and accessories. Many of the companies don't even offer solid wood as an option, and the ones that do charge a hefty premium for them. Adding an 1.5 inch thick solid wood top can cost upwards of $700 over the cost of the base. And that's more than double what I spent on all this white oak for this project. Once I have my boards all cut to size, it's time to make what I think is the most important decision of this build, which is how am I going to go about making this top look as good as I can. Some people focus solely on making sure that the growth rings alternate in different directions to try to prevent any warping. I think this is a bit overblown compared to the difference that you can make paying attention to how the boards match up to one another and avoiding any knots, holes, or other defects showing on top of the desk. Once I'm happy with the look, I'm going to go ahead and glue this up into 2 halves because I can't fit the whole desktop through my planer to clean it up. The next tip I want to share with you is that I'm using nothing but wood glue here. You may wonder why I'm not using dominoes or dowels for added strength or alignment. Both of those are great options in applications where the boards are attached at right angles, like breadboards, or if you're making cabinet parts where the additional strength is needed. But for a straight line glue up like this, the glue provides all the strength that's needed. And these boards are already pretty flat as is, so a small clamp across the joint's going to tame any unruly boards and get those seams lined up nice and flush. Once the glue dries, I'm going to run these two halves through my planer just to get them down to 1.5 inches and clean up the surfaces. This top is already looking so amazing, but I do still have one last glue up to get the whole top together. I'm being really careful this time because this is it. Any errors in the alignment are going to have to be taken out when I'm sanding. So I'd rather invest the extra time now than spend extra time sanding this flush later. After the glue dries, I can run a saw across the ends of the table to get everything clean and crisp. Then I'm going to set this top aside for a little while so I can work on some drawers. One thing I regretted when I built my first standing desk a couple years ago was not adding storage. Just something to hold pencils, notepads, the kind of stuff that can end up cluttering a desktop. I cut up some 3/4 inch white oak to make the cabinet boxes, and I'm going to bang these together with dominoes. Unlike gluing up a desktop, this is actually where the domino shines. I thought at first I might be able to use pocket hole joinery on this, but that'd be an awful lot of pocket holes in a very tight space. This way I can just add some glue and tap everything together. Since these are solid wood cases, I oriented the grain direction of the back and bottom to be the same. That way as the bottom expands and contracts, the back is going to move along with it in the same direction. I'm also going to go ahead and clean the glue squeeze out as I go. Even though the inside of these drawers is really never going to be seen, I do have to install some drawer slides and I don't want any interference from dried glue. The sides then pop on relatively easily and everything gets clamped up. If you're asking what about those small mortises that look like they're for hinges, well, they're not, but I'll explain what they are for later in the video. For now, I need to build some drawers. To make those, I decided to use some scraps of Baltic birch ply that I had from a previous project. These drawers are so small they don't really require much material, and buying a full sheet just wasn't justified. So, today I pour one out for all my wood hoarding homies who said, one day I may use that, and they never did. Smile down, my friends, and know that I scored one for all of us. Where was I? Oh yeah, so you know where you thought I should be using dominoes, but instead I just used glue, and then when I could have used pocket holes, instead I used dominoes? Well, now I'm using pocket holes. This is the same method that I use for all the drawers I make, and I think it's one of the best uses for pocket hole joinery. I like how quick it is to get all the drawers together, and there's no mess because there's no glue. These tiny drawers won't ever hold that much weight, but even for a full-size cabinet, this method is plenty strong. I like aligning the slide along the bottom edge of the drawer, that way I can use the slide itself to find out exactly where to attach it. Then I can use a scrap of 1/2 inch ply to locate where the other side is going to go inside of the drawer box. A pro tip is to install slides using some type of positive reference like a scrap of plywood versus measuring and marking. This way you know the slides are going to be exactly parallel on both sides no matter what, and you don't have to think about it or risk messing up a measurement. And the drawer just slides right in. Pun intended. Now, to explain those mystery mortises on the top. I wanted to find a very low profile way to attach the drawer boxes to the underside of the desk, and to do that I came up with the idea of using aluminum flat bar. So I cut mine to length at the miter saw, and then drilled a pair of holes on each end. The outer holes will be used to fasten the bar to the drawer box, and then the inner holes are going to be used to fasten the drawer box to the table bottom. And I just need to widen that second set of holes into slots, that way I can account for wood movement and then drop them right into those mortises. And this way they sit below the surface and the drawer box is going to fasten flush to the bottom of the table. And to cut those shallow mortises, I just set up a straight bit in my router table and kind of worked the piece back and forth until I got to depth. The only other way I could think to do this safely was to do it with a chisel and mallet, so if you don't have a router, there is another option to get this job done. The drawer fronts get cut a little narrower than the sides. This is going to allow for a small gap at the top, which is going to prevent any interference or binding against the tabletop. And attaching these are easy, it just requires a clamp and a couple screws. And if you're wondering about drawer pulls, well, at this point, so am I. I really haven't figured out exactly what I want to do there because I'm really liking the clean and flush look of these drawer fronts. That's something I'll figure out down the road. I'm really not too worried about it right now. I think what I may end up doing is routing a small finger hold into the bottom edge. That way I can keep the clean look of the fronts. And with the case all together, I can sand all the joints flush. Another accessory that I regret not building for my old standing desk is a monitor stand. My new design has this nice curved profile in it to match the curve that I'm going to put in the front of the desk, and to make that happen, I'm going to share with you one of my favorite tips. Anytime you build furniture with sweeping curves or any type of complex angles to them, it pays to make a template. It could be made from paper that you print out or something more substantial like plywood. Making a template means that you can have a chance to experiment and play around with your designs before you commit to cutting up anything in your project material. And because this is an experimental process, template design is kind of fluid, but it does help to add some guide marks like where you want the beginning and end of a curve to be or how deep you want that curve to go. Placement of holes, rounding of corners, things like that. And one of the best hacks for making large sweeping curves is to use a flexible straight edge. To cut away the waste, I'm going to use a jigsaw and then stay about a 1/16 of an inch away from that line. Then you can just use a sander to sand back to that line. Sanders are also great for rounding off the corners. And holes are easy too. You just need to use a drill bit that matches the size of the hole you want. So to attach the template to your workpiece, I like using two-sided tape. The holding power is really strong and it doesn't require any fancy jigs with toggle clamps to make the cuts. I could immediately begin using a router with a flush trim bit, but I find it easier to cut away the bulk of the waste using my bandsaw. If you don't have a bandsaw, that's okay. You can still use your jigsaw. You're just going to want to draw a reference line in front of the template, remove that template so that you can use the jigsaw, and then reattach the template right where you drew the line. And finally, we can go ahead and use that router with a flush trim bit to remove the remainder of the waste. This can be done with a handheld router as well. The procedure is the same, but upside down, or right side up, whatever. Regardless of how you do it, don't mess up and forget about grain direction like I just did. So whenever you cut a curve, there's going to be a change in the direction of the grain, which can tear out like this. We can fix this though. I just need to realign my template, moving it back about a 1/16 of an inch. Now I'm only going to cut halfway down the curve, then change directions and make a climb cut. Making this cut can be, well, surprising if you don't have a firm grip on your workpiece. That's because the bit is now spinning in the same direction that you're moving the work across the bit. Basically, it wants to grab your workpiece and throw it. And now I've removed enough of that gouge that I can clean the rest of this up during finish sanding. To make the hole for cable management, I need to use a Forstner drill bit. And to help make that cut, I'm going to use a portable drill guide. Think of it like a portable drill press. It connects to your cordless drill, and then you can position that over your target area. And one thing I suggest with these big Forstner bits is it's a good idea to clamp the guide down to your workpiece so that it doesn't shift around during such an aggressive cut. Now I can just hog out all this material and not have to worry if the drill bit is staying at a perfect 90 degrees. Man, look at that pile of shavings. This gets quite messy, so a shot of compressed air to clear the area is in order. As you can see here, I left a little material by drilling with a slightly smaller drill bit. That way, if the workpiece gets chewed up by a dull drill bit or there's some blowout, I can use the router bit to cut the waste flush to the template and clean all that up. And that's how you keep your holes sparkly clean.
It's disgusting.
Oh boy. Well, moving right along. I want the top to have the same basic profile as the monitor stand with the curved front and corners, and since I already showed you how to do this with a template, I'm going to go ahead and let the CNC tackle this one. So you may be asking, if you could just cut it out on a CNC, why do you need the template in the first place? Well, first and foremost, I'm a teaching channel, and so I think there's value in knowing how to do these things without the help of a CNC. I mean, I'm all for it, obviously, but I think it needs to add value to my process. And in this case, the value that's being added is I'm just going to get this done with minimal filming and teaching, but I can still show you what's possible using a large format CNC like this Avid machine. The only other thing I want to do to the top is to knock off those edges using a chamfer bit in my palm router, but that's not going to happen if it keeps moving. Bench cookies to the rescue. Now it's nice and grippy. Aside from being one of the messier activities you can do, using a small router like this is so satisfying. And remember to get the cable hole as well, and we are good to go. I'm finishing the desk with more Rubio 5% smoke. I won't bore you with that again. And while that cures, I'm going to get the sit-stand desk base assembled. I need to be able to attach the drawers to the bottom of the table, but to do that, I need to use the base as a reference to know exactly where to place them. I'm not going to bore you with the whole assembly, but I did want to mention that this base is from a brand called Uplift. They're not sponsoring this video, I just had a really good experience when I used them on the first standing desk that I built, and so I'm going to go ahead and use them this time around. For 2 years, the standing desk in my office has worked flawlessly, and I have absolutely no complaints about the base. I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below if you want to check it out for your own build. And now I can introduce said base to the top and make sure that I'm all spaced evenly. According to my design, these drawers should nestle right into where the cross brace meets the leg assembly. And from the looks of this, it looks like that the manufacturer's measurements online were very accurate. Now that I'm positive everything fits together, I can go ahead and fasten the base to the top. I need to pre-drill these holes, and I'm using a tape flag as a depth stop so that I don't blow right through the top of the table, and drive the screws home. Then I can do the same thing for each of the drawers using the aluminum bars that I installed. The only challenging bit here is getting inside those small drawers to drive 4 screws, but luckily there's a tool for everything. This little bike wrench works perfectly for this job. Then in go the drawers, and on goes the brains of this operation. And now I can get the first glimpse of the finished top. I really love the low profile drawers and the curve in the front, and the finish really makes this white oak pop. Okay, enough oogling. I need to finish this monitor stand. One thing I really like about my standing desk is that I integrated a hidden wireless phone charger. It turns out it's nice that when you're sitting at your desk for hours all day that you have a phone laying there and it's being charged constantly without having to have a cord laying around. But adding it to the monitor stand makes a lot more sense than integrating it into the desktop, so that's what I'm doing this time. I'm going to build a small center console using dominoes and then add a piece of plywood at the top. The main purpose of this plywood is just to provide a place for the charger to attach to, since my monitor stand is a little too thin to implant the charger fully. Once that hole's been cut, I can then add a small wire access hole to the back. I'm going to use dominoes to attach the console, but this is kind of tricky. I decided the best approach was to line it up as best I could and then mark reference lines where the dominoes needed to be cut. I'm only adding 1 domino per side, and these won't be glued into the monitor stand. Friction is going to be enough to hold it in place, and this is going to give me an option down the road if I want to change something out. Then I can mark out where I need to drill the holes in the stand and leave only about 1/8 of an inch of wood at the top. This will ensure that the charger is close enough to the phone to make contact. Then I can use the tiniest drill bit ever to make a pinhole through the top. You'll see why in a minute. I'm attaching the legs to the monitor stand the same way, just using loose dominoes, no glue. Then the center console goes back in place, and the charger, which is from Mocket.com, goes into its new home. A couple tiny screws are going to cinch it into place so it stays in contact with the top, and that's it. When I plug in the charger, a little LED is going to shine through that tiny pinhole I made so that you always know where your target is when you need to charge your phone. Pretty nifty. Alright, so there is one more feature that I want to add to this desk, and I think this one is the one that I'm most stoked about, and that's adding LED lights to the area underneath the monitor stand. To make that happen, I cut a shallow recess under the stand using my palm router, which is going to house the track that the LEDs sit in. The router bit's going to leave rounded corners, and so I need to go back and square those up with a chisel. Now I can cut this aluminum track at 45 degrees and tap it into place. The aluminum track is going to act as a heat sink for the LEDs and also protect them. I follow the path of the recess, making 45-degree cuts and fitting them together like this. These LEDs have an adhesive backing that's going to help them stick to the track, which makes installation pretty easy. And the LEDs can be cut at these copper terminals, which means that you can create custom links with them. And connecting all these strips back together is easy using these connector wire jumper thingies that just crimp onto those copper terminals. This way you have one continuous circuit of LEDs even though they're all running in different directions, which I think is pretty cool. Now that I have all my wires connected and tucked away, I can add a diffuser strip, and this is not only going to soften the LED light but also protect them from damage. Now it's time to test this job out. I'm going to use this controller and plug it into the LEDs, and then my power supply goes in here, and woohoo! Man, I am so relieved that worked. And the controller that I'm using is Bluetooth enabled, which means that these LEDs can be controlled using an app on your phone. Pretty darn cool. The only minor inconvenience is that you need the app to turn the lights on and off, and I wanted to make something a little more convenient, so I bought this little touch on-off switch. This plugs in between the power supply and the controller, and now I can turn these lights on and off and still control them with the app. And I want to put this button on the front of the center console, which means drilling a hole big enough for the switch to fit in. But when I was installing this, I discovered a small problem, realizing that the threads on the back of the button weren't long enough to go all the way through the wood so that I could use the ring nut to fasten it. So I'm going to have to go to plan B and just epoxy this button in place. Not ideal, but it'll get the job done. With everything connected, I can go ahead and tuck all the wires inside the console safely before popping some rubber feet on the bottom of the stand. With the monitor stand done, I can move the desk into its new home, and I am done. Well, that's it. Thanks for hanging in there with me through this whole project. I know that my wife's going to absolutely love working in this new space. And until next time, have fun in the shop or the office.